that could display the title of the sermon for the upcoming Sunday, I could have written, Canaanite Lives Matter. And I think that probably would have drawn some curiosity, maybe even a little suspicion, perhaps some contempt or anger. I don't know. But today in our gospel, I felt like I could not get that idea out of my head. So I want to recall the scene that Matthew narrates, and a little bit before that scene. You remember last week we heard the story of Jesus walking on the water, walking on the waves that were crashing the boat, and how he saved Peter, who was sinking, who cried out. And that Greek word is kratzai, which is kind of meant to evoke the raven's screech or cry. It's like a scream, really. He screamed out. And Jesus, who had called him, and originally from the boat, grasps his hand and says, "You have little faith." And he brings him up with him. Now, after that scene, after they get to the shore, the Pharisees come to him, and he has some pointed arguments with them. And they say to him, "Why are you trampling on our traditions? Why are you breaking the traditions and teaching others to break them? Why don't you respect the traditions of our elders?" And Jesus responds that, you can be faithful to the tradition and miss its very meaning. You can be hypocrites, which means you can just be actors, not really being holy, just sort of acting like you are. And he quotes, I think it's Isaiah, "The people honors me only with lip service while their hearts are far from me." He talks about what is clean and unclean, and he says what goes into the mouth is not what makes a person unclean, but what comes out of it. Jesus is arguing that we can sometimes confuse outward practices with the central form of our spirituality. We can sometimes make idols out of our traditions. But God desires not just piety, but new hearts, new people. People made holy by how they treat and act toward one another. From the heart comes those evil intentions. These are the things that make a person unclean, he says. But to eat with unwashed hands, that does not make a person unclean. That fear of change, that fear of breaking traditions has not left us. People fear change and fear criticism of tradition, but do not always take the time to see how certain traditions undermine the very values that they were meant to uphold. We can see ourselves in a line of heroes who have come before us, who have fought the fight we fight now, who have built the community within which we live. And that seeing ourselves in that tradition is a virtuous thing, to be sure. But to forget that we fight the fight for one another, that we fight to build a more perfect union, as the preamble of our Constitution has it, to forget that we fight to build a community of justice and peace for all, to forget those things is to cheapen the sacrifice of those who came before us. It is to be hypocritical. That is, to celebrate our tradition and our history without really learning its lessons. So anyway, that's the scene. That's the scene. And I took a little time because that fight is what drove Jesus to retreat. That's the word, that withdraw. Withdraw is actually kind of like a military metaphor. To the region of Tyre and Sidon, which is east of the Jordan, outside of Israel. It's where Elijah went when he fled Ahab and Jezebel, who sought to kill him because they didn't like his prophecies. It's also the place, though, by the way, where Elijah encountered that widow who had a child. That widow who was not a child of Israel. And Elijah healed her son. That story is surely in the background here. And so Jesus withdraws, and then the gospel says, and our translation doesn't quite do this, but the old translation was, behold. He retreats, and then the gospel says, behold. And out came a Canaanite woman, shouting, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. Which is Kyrie eleison. That's what she shouts out. That's what she screams out. Screams out. Remember Peter who screamed kratzai as he was drowning. Now she also kratzais, screams out, Lord, have mercy. And you all must remember who the Canaanites were. They were that ancient people of the land that God drove out before the Israelites. They were the ancient people that God drove out of the land before the Israelites. And God was constantly scolding through the prophets, the Israelites, because they were tempted by the gods of the Canaanites, by the Baals and Astartes. They intermingled and intermarried with the Canaanites, but the Canaanites were never ever considered their equals. And so the disciples tell Jesus, get rid of her somehow. Send her away. But Jesus does not do that. But he does insult her by calling her a dog and saying that he was not sent to people like her, but to the lost sheep of Israel. She is a dog, but he was sent to the sheep. And really, he compares her, or maybe it's her daughter, because the word for dog is actually kind of like little dogs, like mutts. God's gifts are not for her or her sick daughter. God's grace is for others, he seems to imply. And I think that's difficult. I think it's difficult for us who believe that Jesus is God's incarnate presence on earth. It's difficult for us to handle this scene and to understand it, because Jesus is frankly displaying bias. He's insulting her. Just after he argues that the Pharisees don't get it, they're judging the wrong thing, they judge the outward and pious practices and confuse it with real religion, here Jesus is now judging a person because of their ethnicity, their race even. So what do we do with that? Well, for now, let me just continue. Let's read on. Because she does not give up. And I thought of Howard Thurman, who I spoke about a few months ago, who learned from his grandmother, who was a slave in Florida, that God loved him. God loved him even when the world despised his black skin. God loved him unconditionally. He heard, you are a child of God. That's what he heard in all of the Bible that was preached and read to him. You are loved by God. And that was the guiding force for him. And he became famous and a leader in the civil rights movement and a mentor of Martin Luther King. And so I wonder if that's what the Canaanite woman saw too. She said, you are wrong. I am not a dog. And I know, she didn't exactly say that, but I think that's what her point was. She said, I am also worthy of God's grace. My sick daughter is also worthy. Remember, she's not fighting this fight for herself. She is a mother with a sick child. She says, there is enough left over, Jesus. There is abundance in what you preach, Jesus. She is calling him to remember the 5,000 he fed and how there were scraps that filled baskets. Jesus, your children are hungry, and your children are everywhere. They are hungry for the grace and healing you bring. That's what she's saying. They are hungry to be included at the table of God, at the banquet of God. They can see in you, Jesus, the promise of a different community, a more beloved community in which the storms and crashing waves of division and anger and strife and lies calm, and the sea becomes peaceful again. She, this daughter of Canaan, this mother of a sick child, is calling to Jesus to remember that there is room enough for us all. That the lives of those on the margins matter. The lives of those who have been excluded matter. The lives of those who have been battered and overwhelmed by years of violence matter. This is her faith, and it should be ours too. God called the Israelites again and again to remember the poor among them, the widow and the orphan and the stranger. And yes, the Israelites can be at the table too. But God is big enough for all of us. And God's grace is abundant, not scarce. And our love for one another can be abundant too. If Jesus can be woken up, then so can we. Amen.